This is Duke University.
It's lovely to have everyone here. I first wanted to give some thanks for various colleagues and groups that have supported this annual human rights lecture, which we hope to make a regular thing. First of all, we'd like to thank the provost for helping us think out this idea, the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Keenan Institute for Ethics and their Human Rights Center, Latino Studies, International Comparative Studies, History, the Human Rights Archive, Cultural Anthropology, the International Human Rights Law Clinic, and the International and Comparative Law Clinic over at the law school. Thank you so much for your support. This is obviously a subject that's very much in the news. Immigration, in particular immigration from the Americas, has become one of the defining issues of our time. But it isn't a new issue. Migration, the movement of human beings across our planet, is as old as human civilization itself. What's different is the way people move across national borders with or without documents as a result of violent calamity or slow-moving disaster. What to do about these human migrations has only been a rights issue recently, and by that I mean in the late 20th century. Terms we now throw around with a great deal of carelessness, refugee, asylum seeker, temporary protected status, undocumented, DACA, are deeply modern and reflect an intense debate over what it means to be human and move, and under what circumstances and with what resources, accompaniment, futures, and limitations. The heat and confusion of this debate now is heightened by one of our, meaning our American, cyclical turns to demonizing immigrants, where once it was the Germans or the Chinese or the Poles or the Italians or the Irish, it's now Mexicans or Central Americans. It's the same filthy script, the same appeals to fear, the same ringing of the blasted bell of nationalism and racism. Scholar of human rights Micheline Aishe would call this a cult of authenticity, where politicians exploit populations beset by economic or cultural fears by claiming that there is something essential and immutable that separates the us from the them, that allows whole groups to be characterized as criminals and rapists, though, to be sure, with some good people. What is the antidote? How can we examine more clearly who immigrants are, what the histories of immigration are, what role they actually play? How can we cut through the noise? I can think of no better tool than the writing of our guest today, Margaret Regan. I was introduced to her book, The Death of Josseline, by my colleague, Sally Deutsch, who's in the history. I confess I was immediately struck not with the content of Margaret's books, but how beautiful the writing is. Margaret has a rare gift to make even the most horrifying, complex situations flow like silk over the page. That's no criticism. To the contrary, it's the kind of clarity and quiet that in fact speaks with the loudest voice possible. Above all, Regan is a chronicler of the human. The fact that whether we are American or otherwise, on one side of the border or on the other, whether we are documented or not, we are joined inevitably and unbreakably by our humanity. Regan is a longtime journalist who's based in Tucson, and she started writing about the border in 2000. She's won many journalism awards, too many to go into, for her arts criticism, her reporting, and her stories on the Irish immigrant experience. And just to conclude, both of her books, Detained and Deported, which she's going to be talking about today, and The Death of Josseline, are available over here. So please feel free to come after her talk and buy a book. She's also available to sign. And please join me in welcoming Margaret to Duke.
I'm so thrilled to be here. I've never been to Duke before, and it's really an honor to be invited to a university of this caliber. And I'm really thrilled that people here are reading all my books. I want to also welcome my three sisters are here to hear my talk, and all of them have worked for social justice their whole lives. Now, I'm sorry to say I am suffering from some laryngitis, and my sister Eileen here, local, she lives in Chapel Hill. She has a beautiful singing voice. So she also has a beautiful reading voice. She's just going to read a little passage from the book as an introduction. Usually I read it myself. The book is Detained and Deported. It's about those two prongs of immigration that we're seeing right now. So this starts out with my visiting a detention center in rural Arizona and my visit with a young mother named Yolanda who had been incarcerated in the detention center for 2 years. I don't have any pictures of Yolanda. They didn't allow me to take any when I was there, but this is a picture of the outside of Eloy. And then we're going to go down to Mexico and hear from a man who'd already been deported across the border. So Eileen is going to read that for us, and then I will talk.
Thank you. It's an honor to do this for you, Margaret. Yolanda Fontes sat in her prison scrubs and watched the families gathered all around her. Husbands were reconnecting with wives, sisters with sisters, mothers with children. It was a sunny Sunday in April, and the families had flocked to the Eloy Detention Center, a dreary for-profit immigration prison in rural Arizona, to visit their detained loved ones. A female prisoner sat with her small son on her lap, her arms wrapped tightly around him, as if she were imagining never letting him go. The aunt who had brought the little boy spoke sorrowfully to her sister as the child snuggled in his mother's embrace. Nearby, an imprisoned father sat across a table from his wife, clutching her hand. They were trying to talk, but their 4-year-old daughter, hungry and tired, fussed on the floor below. None of the families in the packed room had any privacy. An impassive guard presided over their melancholy reunions, keeping a close watch on the mothers and fathers dressed in jailbird scrubs. The visiting room was bleak and windowless, lit by glaring prison lights. It was a beautiful spring day outside, but no rays of sunlight pierced its cinder block walls. Alone among the detainees in this stark space, Yolanda had no family visiting, just me, a writer who had come to hear her story. She was glad to be out of her prison unit, and she was full of smiles, determined to be cheerful. Yet her tale was grim, and she looked at the other detainees' kids wistfully as she recounted it. During the 2 years she'd spent locked up in Eloy, she'd seen her 2 little girls and her little boy only sporadically. The children, all American citizens, lived in a distant suburb northwest of Phoenix. They came to visit their mom only when a relative or friend could spare the time to drive the 200-mile round trip to Eloy. The last time Yolanda had seen them was 2 months before. Yolanda was 32. She'd slipped into Arizona from Mexico 17 years before, when she was 15. She spoke flawless English, and even though she had no papers, she'd almost never had any difficulty finding a job. And until 2 years ago, she'd never had trouble with immigration. But the father of her 2 younger children regularly beat her, and one attack triggered a series of disasters that eventually landed her in jail and now detention. The abusive ex had the 2 kids, and Yolanda was facing deportation. She could have accepted removal to Mexico right away and gotten out of Eloy, but if she were deported, she would lose the children. So she stayed in the prison month after month, fighting her case, hoping to persuade a judge to overturn the deportation order, praying to get back to her daughters and her son. Yolanda's spirits flagged just once during the 2 hours we talked. The last time the kids came to see her, she said, her 5-year-old, little V, had looked at her suspiciously. He told me I didn't look like his mother, she said, her eyes filling with tears. Her own child was starting to forget her. Down in Nogales, on the Mexican side of the border, Gustavo Sancho Perez was just as worried about his kids. He was a 25-year-old landscaper from Phoenix. I met him early one hot July morning at a Catholic comedor just steps from the international line. He was one of 60 deportees eating a hearty breakfast of beans and rice in a humble dining hall run by an order of Mexican nuns. Like Yolanda, Gustavo had moved with his family from Mexico to the United States as a child. Born in Veracruz, he'd come to Phoenix at the age of 8 and lived there ever since. He spoke perfect English. He and his wife had 2 small children, a boy of 4 and a baby girl, both of them U.S. citizens. Gustavo had been arrested in Phoenix for riding his bicycle at night without a light, and then detained by ICE. He'd rotated through several detention centers in Arizona and in Colorado before being tossed back over the border into Nogales. He'd always worked hard to support his children. What was their mother doing now, he wondered, without his wages coming in? He was staying in a shelter, but he would have to leave soon. Nogales was reeling under a deluge of deportees from the United States, and the town's shelters didn't have the resources to have los deportados longer than 3 days. Gustavo would have to move on. His mother in Phoenix had advised him to go back to Veracruz, but he had no intention of returning to a place where everyone was a stranger. He knew where he needed to be, with his children at home in Phoenix. The way to get back to them lay over the border and through the Arizona desert. But the journey would be perilous in more ways than one. He could die out there in the heat, as so many had done before him. And if he made it through, he ran the risk of arrest. If they catch me, he said, I get 10 years in jail.
So that kind of gives you some idea of the stories in this book. As Professor Kirk said, immigration is a really contentious subject in the United States right now. But I think it's our obligation as Americans to understand the real life impact of the policies we have towards immigrants. Even those who support the harsher laws that we're seeing now, I think people really need to know. And that's what I try to do in my work. I wanted to just talk a little bit how I came upon this subject. As Robin said, I live in Arizona. Around about the year 2000, we first started hearing reports of migrant deaths. Until that time, it was very rare for migrants to die in the desert. Now we're accustomed to it, but it was because of policies under the Clinton administration in which we sealed up the safe crossings, primarily in San Diego and in El Paso, that forced, others would say that's the wrong word, but I think they were forced into the dangerous deserts and mountains in between. The Clinton administration thought this was going to be an easy fix. We would end illegal, undocumented immigration. But it wasn't. People were desperate enough that they went into that treacherous desert anyway. And just a few years after these new policies and new walls went into effect, we started seeing large numbers of migrant deaths. This young girl is named Joseline. I still get upset every time I tell her story. She was a 14-year-old girl who died in the desert 2 hours away from my house. She was a child from El Salvador, like many children in Mexico and in Central America. She had been left behind by parents who went to work in the United States. She was left with her grandparents and her little brother, who was 4 years younger. And this may be just a random photo of her back home, but it always strikes me as the picture of a child with sort of a hard life, kind of a sad life with her family split up. In 2008, her mother, Sonia in LA, finally saved up the money to smuggle the children across the border. It's about $8,000, and you may know that immigrants go into terrible debt to finance these things, and then they're enthralled to these money lenders. The mom thought that the kids were traveling with people that cared about them. They got all the way through Mexico, and people don't know maybe that when they get to the Arizona border, outside the treacherous desert, they're in terrible shape. They've already been traveling, they haven't been eating well, they haven't been sleeping well. A lot of them have gastrointestinal issues. She arrived at the border in Sasabe, Arizona in January of 2008. And ironically, this week is the 10-year anniversary of her death. She was found on February 20th, 2008. What happened was she got sick. It was actually cold. It was January. We do get cold in Arizona, and it was wet. And they were traveling through the Tumacacary Wilderness, which is just like it sounds. It's spiky, but it's mountainous. I went out there last year for memorial service at the site where Joseline died, and a woman in our group fell and really hurt herself because it's just such difficult terrain to travel. That's where they were going through. People go far away into these bad wilderness areas to get away from the Border Patrol. So with any addition of border enforcement, we have more deaths. That's been the reality. Joseline fell ill. We think probably she had drunk some bad water. She became very ill. She couldn't walk anymore. And this is what happens to migrants in those coyotes, the smugglers that bring them across. Some of them are okay, but most of them are not. They left this child in the desert, very ill, in January. And we're told that the little brother really screamed and cried, and Joseline said to him, "No, you keep going and go to mom." It took them 3 days to get to Los Angeles, 3 days before the little boy had to tell his mom that they left Joseline behind in the desert. And then the alarm went up, and she wasn't found for 3 weeks. And during the period, she was found 3 weeks later, totally by accident. Somebody happened to be going up that trail. And then they had to do DNA tests. The father flew out from Baltimore to do a DNA test to certify that it was his daughter. During that time, before they had definitely identified Joseline, the coyote called the mother in Los Angeles, and he said to her, "Don't believe what they're telling you, that they have Joseline in the morgue in Tucson. I have her right here and she's fine. If you give me another $1,000, I will bring her to you." It's some understanding of the rough things these people go through. So Joseline is very close to my heart because I've written about her. I've seen her autopsy report. And I ended up naming my book for her. That's this earlier book, The Death of Josseline, because she was, her story was among the most tragic that I uncovered. But, her story was only one of many. The year that she died in 2008, fiscal 2008, she was one of 183 bodies found in the Arizona desert. And many bodies are never found. If that young man hadn't accidentally come across Joseline's body, we would never know about her. There are many people who are missing. But of the bodies found, this is a figure I like to tell people, between the year 2000, when all this started, up until last December 31st, 2017, just in Arizona, we have found 3,209 bodies. I just want to say that number again. 3,209 bodies of people who died in my neighborhood, right here on U.S. soil. The UN has studied this issue as a human rights issue, and their data show border-wide, since in the same time period, 7,216 people. That's a lot of deaths, and it's amazing to me how rarely it's discussed in the national discourse. So I wrote this whole book about the whole, the journey of the migrants and the deaths and the difficulties, and also we were talking in a class today about the impacts of all that border enforcement personnel and apparatus in the US, the effects on American citizens. We are deprived of some of our constitutional rights. because of certain laws that exclude, if you're 100 miles from the Border Patrol can stop you without cause and question you, and they do all the time when you go down there. And some people they really harass, particularly members of the Tohono-O'odham Nation, a large Indian nation down there. Constant complaints from them about harassment by the Border Patrol. So these things are really complicated. You know, there's much more to it. You know, you put up the border walls, you add Border Patrol. It has all kinds of consequences that are not really discussed. But at the end of the time writing this book, I ended up putting this chapter in that led me to my next project. These three young people, Marlene, Omar, and Araceli, were proud high school graduates in Tucson. They were all the first person in their family to graduate from college. They had all been brought to Tucson as children from Mexico. They got caught because Marlene had a baby, and in her minimum wage job at Panda Express, I didn't mention they all three were working at Panda Express. I'm sure many of you have had the pleasure of eating that food when you're trapped in an airport. That's where they worked. Again, it's like a mile from my house where they were working. All this stuff envelops us in Arizona. So she applied for benefits, food benefits for her child, Freddie, who was a US citizen, not knowing that the same Social Security number, the fake Social Security number she had used to work at Panda Express, had anything wrong with it. She didn't know the difference. She used that Social Security number. The thing was referred to the Department of Public Safety, which is kind of the highway police plus the statewide police that usually goes after drug dealers and other big crimes. So they did an investigation of Marlene, and her lawyer gave me the stack of papers this high, the staff power, the number of hours they spent investigating this young minimum wage worker was extraordinary. And it turned out in her 4 years of working since high school, she had earned less than $50,000. So they staged a raid on Marlene's trailer in South Tucson. They came early in the morning, which is a typical procedure in these raids, and they bang on the door. Many cars, many officers, maximum humiliation. She gets out of bed, she's got the baby, she's in her pajamas. The cops say, give her, the officers say, you have to give the baby to your sister. The baby's screaming. She asked if she could get out of her pajamas and put clothes on just for some dignity. They said no. They cuffed her and they drove her away, in a big siren. A few hours later, they raided Panda Express. When they found out that Marlene was working at Panda Express, they investigated the whole thing. And big surprise, 11 out of 12 of the workers at that location were undocumented. And Omar told me that, in fact, the bosses at Panda Express would hand out fake Social Security numbers. That's an allegation. So they raided the Panda Express. They came in the front, they came in the back. Same thing, 18 cars, big deal. And they all got carted off to the DPS prison in Arizona and held. At that time, if you were accused of being an undocumented immigrant, you had no right to bail, no matter how small or big the crime. So they all ended up, the 11 workers who got arrested, by the way, the other guy had called in sick, was never heard of again. Lucky him. So they have to go to jail. They're not convicted. They're charged with felony identity theft. And Arizona, specifically under Governor Janet Napolitano, had made a fake Social Security number, using one, a felony specifically. And Napolitano, she was head of Homeland Security under President Obama. There's statements by her saying, this will really get those immigrants and make them stop working. So it was designed particularly to ensnare immigrants. And when our current president talks about criminal aliens, this is the type of crime that we're talking about. That's a felony. It sounds bad, but it's because they're using a Social Security number. Long story short, they had an amazing lawyer who argued the case down to a misdemeanor, which is a big deal. And the judge said, great, served a time, time served, goodbye, have a good life. But waiting at the doorway of the courthouse were the ICE people. And all of them were led away in chains. They all were, they finished their criminal thing. Then they were led to the detention centers. And they stayed in the detention centers for many months. All the rest of them were deported. These three had cases. They all had U.S. citizen children. And they ended up having a lot of supporters who bonded them out, which is kind of a different thing. When I first met Marlene, she had finally gotten out of prison and the detention center, and her baby no longer knew her. He was sitting in his mother's lap, and he was afraid of her. I was sitting there in the kitchen watching this whole thing. And she said, I always felt like I was a real contributor. I always worked, really proud. I went to high school. She said, but I was treated like a criminal, which was really hard for her and for all of them, obviously. But she said, I will never forget that they separated me from my child. So after that, I decided to investigate the detention centers. I know we don't have a whole lot of time. I probably should talk less. Ellis Island, we think of that so fondly, and we have all those nice sepia pictures of our ancestors coming over, and nowadays we think, oh, look at our great-grandparents, they were so wonderful, they wanted to be Americans, and we have this whole different attitude about them now. Ellis Island was a detention and a deportation center, and so was Angel Island on the west coast that dealt with Asian immigrants. Ellis Island closed down in the 1950s, and at that time the old INS said, well, we're done with the detention centers. We don't think that's appropriate in the United States. We're not going to do them anymore, so they shut them down. And a Supreme Court justice named Tom C. Clark in 1958 wrote, physical detention of aliens is now the exception. Certainly this policy reflects human qualities of an enlightened civilization. So that enlightenment lasted 22 years. And then we had the Marielitos. I talked to a class today, and I don't think they knew anything about the Marielitos, but it was in my lifetime. What year was that? The last year of the Carter administration, I guess that's 1980. So 125,000 Cubans showed up on the shores of Florida, having traveled in flimsy boats. And anybody who was around them remembers the absolute hysteria about these people. Castro had tricked us. He opened the insane asylums. He opened the jails. These people were all terrible. Complete hysteria. And Jimmy Carter, he was taken up in it, the great humanitarian. He opened up a whole bunch of temporary detention centers, makeshift places as best as he could. Pretty soon, many of them got out pretty quickly, but I could find in my research that 5 years later, 1,000 people were still being held in a maximum security prison in Atlanta. No trial, no conviction, no nothing. Next year, President Reagan gets into office, and we have the Haitian boat people. The Haitian boat people were fleeing the Duvalier regime, an abusive, dictator, and they were looking for asylum, and President Reagan denied. He said, these people are economic migrants, just like so many other migrants, and he did the same thing. He put them in these temporary centers. So after that, the INS declared that now deportation would be the rule and not the exception. And they published 1982. This is the deal from now on. So the race was on. The Corrections Corporation of America, which is the leading private prison company in the United States now, they incorporated right after that. Their first business was building a detention center for immigrants in Texas. They also went into the very lucrative business of building criminal prisons. Many of our criminal inmates now are held in for-profit private places, prisons. So this is Eloy, where Eileen read so nicely about Yolanda. That's hidden away in the Arizona landscape, very far from the highway where nobody will ever see it, and most of the detention centers are like that. Americans don't generally know about them. Right now, Eloy has about 1,600 beds. It's the largest in the United States, and it's unusual because it has both men and women. Okay, so I went on a press tour to Eloy, and we were allowed to take photographs, and my good friend Jay Rockland, who's photographed a lot of my stories, and I went together. And the whole wrap, they were giving us this tour. It's a private detention center, but ICE, nominally is at the top. The whole wrap was, this is not a prison, this is not a prison. And they told Jay not to take that picture, but he did anyway. He was pretty good about surreptitiously, because they didn't want any photos of things that made it look like a prison. Right now in the United States, we have about 250 different detention centers. And in the course of most years, we have usually about 400,000 people passing through there. The thing about detention is it's not like being in a jail where you know when you're going to leave. You can be there for a really long time. If you are seeking asylum and you lose, you can appeal it, and you can stay and stay. I met one woman in Eloy, been in there for 3 years. I met a man at another detention center who had been in detention for 7 years. When I visited him, he said, this will be my 7th Christmas in detention. So it's quite different, and despite all we hear about the illegal aliens, illegal, immigration is a status offense, which means you're not entitled to a lawyer. What do you call it, Amory? Public defender. My sister, the lawyer. You're not entitled to a public defender. I mean, sure, if you have money, go ahead. Or if you can find a nonprofit, there are a lot of them, but there just aren't anywhere near enough attorneys to go around. And obviously, those who get attorneys have a much better chance of getting out and succeeding in their cases than those that do not have attorneys. These detention centers around the United States, some of them are just like little drunk lockups, and they want to get in on the money. There's so much money in the business of detention that a county jail will designate like a corridor of cells for the prisoners, and those are much worse. So we only have 11 centers run by ICE itself. That is, we the people, we only own and operate 11 of those 250 detention centers. And I've been to the one in Arizona. It's still a detention center, but it's much better. They have 7-day-a-week family visitation. The food is decent. People have access to the out of doors more often. But the money is a big motivation for a lot of these places. Now, Yolanda they were paying $124 a day to keep her locked up. Now, 2 years ago, President Obama opened 2 family detention centers in Texas after the many Central American women and children came in 2014, the surge, as they call it, everybody called it. Again, that was a big hysteria about that. Anybody remember the people saying these children are bringing diseases, this is a pestilence entering our country? Well, I saw them. I went down to the bus station in Tucson where the Border Patrol had just abandoned 100 women and children with little 3-week-old babies, and they had been in Border Patrol for 3 days, and those kids were starving. Activists were running out, and I remember somebody bought a big thing of chicken from some fast food place, and these little kids went nuts. The mothers told me they had hardly had any food, and they were freezing. That's a typical thing of the Border Patrol. Anyway, they arrived, and these were pretty unthreatening women and children, just trying to escape the disasters in Central America. But Obama, opened those 2 family detention centers in Texas, which are still operating. One is Corrections Corporation of America, one is its rival, GEO Group, and they charge $300 a day per person because of the extra services that they're giving because there are children there. So, I'll just try to go through this. I have some, whoops. Okay, this is inside Eloy Detention Center. These men are Guatemalans. They're waiting for their credible fear interview. They're applying for asylum. There are a lot of asylum seekers in our detention centers. Oops. Okay, this is, these are very sad places that you can imagine, and I like this picture. This was a sort of a church service. There's an evangelical preacher up there, and they were all singing in Spanish and swaying and praying, and a lot of these men just broke down crying. They have no idea when they're getting out. They don't know how their families are doing. Usually they don't get any visitors because if their families are in the U.S., they can't come if they're undocumented. Very sad place. And this picture was taken 2 months after 2 young Guatemalans, 2 days apart, had committed suicide in the Eloy Detention Center. Eloy Detention Center has a high record of deaths from illnesses and from suicides. I think the highest of anybody. This is the women's cell, and again, the guy keeps telling me, my tour guide, he kept saying, this is not a prison. See, he said, it used to be a prison, but we got a really lousy architect to make it not a prison. But you can see it looks just like all the prison movies, right? Those are the showers. Those are the phones, and they do have access to their attorneys on those phones, but it's very expensive for families to call them. There's a whole racket with these special phone companies. I always like this picture because you can see they're ignoring the puzzle, but it's a puzzle of a beautiful place with mountains where maybe they'd like to escape. But these women have nothing to do. There are no programs there because nobody knows how they're going to be there, and plus it would cost money. It would eat into the profits if you provided programs for the women. They can work for $1 a day full-time for the private prison corporation, and most of the low labor and in the detention centers is done by immigrants being paid way under the minimum wage, which really enriches the private prisons corporations. There have been many lawsuits about it. They always lose, and they continue to do it like Yolanda did it because she thought it was good for her just to have something to do. And plus, she got the job of sweeping the judges' chambers in the detention center, and she thought she'd make a good impression if he saw her working. This is a typical cell. Now, Jay did not succeed in this picture. There's actually a toilet right there in the room, which is, really undignified to be kept in conditions like that. The guy said, well, they cooperate with each other. They take turns. And of interest is this amber glaze on the window. It's really much darker in real life. The guy, our tour guide, Shane Kitchen, told me that, I told you it's a co-ed prison, so there are all these different buildings there, so they're marched around from like cafeteria to this and that. So he claimed that one time a woman had exposed her breasts in a window, okay? And all the men went nuts, they're all making noise and stuff. So to deal with that problem, what ICE decided to do was blacken every window in every woman's cell, from here to eternity. So they can't see out the window, and they're in lockdown lots of days. One immigrant I met who was about 60 years old, which skews pretty old for immigrants, she just started suffering panic attacks in there. She just couldn't stand it. She would beg the guards. She was in a room by herself for some reason. She would say, please, I won't escape. Just leave the door open. I can't stand it. And they wouldn't do it. And so she requested deportation after 6 weeks. And a lot of people feel that the conditions are made especially harsh so that people will accept deportation. This just shows you a little bit about the grounds there. Now, I will say for Eloy, they do have a very nice yard, and it's actually pretty. It's rural Arizona, so there are mountains. Of course, in the summer, it's extremely hot, and it's very exposed, but you can drive by there if you ever go up there, which you wouldn't because it's way in the middle of nowhere, but you can see the men playing soccer and the women sort of hanging out together. But they only go out there 1 hour a day. One woman told me, I said, well, at least you can do that. She says, well, it makes me feel worse. It makes me feel worse if I go outside, then I have to go back in. So getting to the other side of the coin, the deportations, I was doing some research and catching up the other day for this talk, and of interest is that Trump is arresting many more people and deporting fewer. So that's interesting. Part of it is that they're arresting people in the middle of the country who are going to make a case for themselves. That's good news for the private prisons, by the way, because the longer they fight their case, they're going to need more detention centers to hold those people. So you don't see in Arizona anymore, you don't see these big crowds. It used to be, you could go down there any day and, wait for the bus, and all these people, the deportees, would go in. There are fewer now. But in the heyday of it, there's so many people being dropped off into these little border towns that don't have the resources to deal with them. These are people coming with no money. Some of them have lost all their identity cards. They accuse the Border Patrol of taking that stuff away from them. So it's kind of a social problem in these northern Mexico communities. So the government organized various services. This is how, it's funny when they get there, the deportees, they get documented. They get a paper that says this is a deportee entitled to services. And you can see that guy with the clear bag. That's what Eloy gives to people for their possessions. So it's a clear marker of a deportee from there. But there's a nurse sitting in a little office there. Once in a while, somebody is really sick and has to get sent to the hospital. Because as I mentioned, Eloy itself does not do a very good job with health care. So sometimes people are released and they are sick. But one of the most important things they do is offer phones. Because a lot of these people have not had the opportunity to call their family after they were picked up. Especially if they've only been out a short time. I've seen people in their little work outfits that were picked up at a gas station or something. So it's really nice for them that they can call their families. And what's remarkable to me, over the time I have reported on this, I used to see mostly border crossers, first time, young people coming over to try their luck. There's a lot of middle-aged people now who have kids. One man I met was like 49. His grown children were up in Seattle. He was a fruit picker. And he was good-natured. He said, well, you guys want the fruit, and I'm happy to pick it. What's the problem? But, these are people who, when they're calling the phone, they're calling their family in the United States. They're calling home. That's the big change in deportation now over what we saw years ago with the many crossings over the border. This is a shelter. They're allowed to stay there in Nogales for 3 nights. Nogales, I don't know if I mentioned, that's the closest border town to me in Tucson, so I go down there a lot. So you can see sort of the despair. This is where Gustavo was saying they're trying to figure out, what am I going to do? It's really hard to cross the border now because there's so much border enforcement, but my kids are in Phoenix, my kids are in Virginia, my kids are in Seattle. I meet a lot of people who go home to Mexico to take care of the elderly parent and then attend the funeral, and then they can't get back in. And they say to me, what am I going to do? My kids are in Florida. It wasn't like this when I came 20 years before. So you have all these people who are highly motivated to cross the border again, no matter what kind of enforcement we do. Some people try again and again. So these guys are just, trying to think what to do next. This is a very nice thing. The comedor that Eileen mentioned, that's where Gustavo was eating breakfast the day I met him. It's a project of the Catholic Diocese of Tucson and Hermosillo, and it's run by the Jesuits, but it's really run by an order of Mexican nuns. Anybody who knows about nuns and priests will understand that the nuns do most of the work there, along with a lot of volunteers. And this is really sort of a nice place. It's kind of a nice thing that happens along the border. The nuns try to be really kind and welcoming because these people have been through hell. And you can see they're not talking or anything. It's not like there's this jolly atmosphere. Here it's mostly men. You can see some women back there. I've seen days down there where like there'll be 20 women. I've seen whole families with little children. Imagine little children going through this whole process. And this is, I like to include this. I met this man at the comedor. We have to think about the push and pull of migration. I'm sure, I don't know, some of you have studied about NAFTA, how it forced something like 2 million people in southern Mexico out of work, the little farmers. We have that push coming up. That was during the Clinton years, that there was that huge migration because people lost their livelihoods with NAFTA when the cheap Iowa corn came down into Mexico. Mexico became a corn importing country, whereas previously it had been a corn exporting company. So there's that, there's the economic stuff that's pushing them out, and of course lately we've heard so much about the violence in Central America, which I have to say the United States plays a part in. We're the ones who were down there having our wars with them, funding those wars and funding those regimes years ago. Those problems are of a long term at this point. But we also have the drug cartels. And again, not to blame the United States all the time, but we're the buyers of the drugs. And also they get most of their guns from us. But there's a lot of violence. And this guy was a fisherman in Veracruz. He really loved being a fisherman. He was telling me it was so great. He really loved being out on the water. But Veracruz is one of the cities where that you started seeing bodies in the street and hanging from the highways. and he got really scared. And he had a friend in Tucson, not much fishing in Tucson, but he decided he was going to try to come to Tucson. He was really one of the poorest of the poor, people who really can't even afford the buses. So he was one of the people who rode the trains. Has anybody ever seen those pictures of the migrants on top of the trains? There are a lot of really good documentaries about it. I mean, it's just astonishing to see. That's what this guy did. He got all the way to 100 miles of the Arizona border. It was very late at night, and some guys started chasing him. If you know about these trains, you may have heard there are many accusations of rape. They're very dangerous for women. There are a lot of robbers. They take advantage of, they're like sitting ducks, literally. So his story that he told me was that some guys were chasing him, and he was running what little money he had, he needed, and he fell off the train. The train kept going and sliced off his leg. And he really would have died, but for the grace of God, I guess. A woman happened to be there, and she called the cops. The cops raced him to Hermosillo. That's a big city with a good hospital, and they saved his life. And of all things, Nogales, Arizona has a company that makes prostheses. And the doctors and nurses said, well, go to Nogales, and they'll build you a new leg. So when I met him, he was waiting for his leg. And he got a dispensation because he only had one leg to stay at the shelter longer than other people. They will do that out of kindness. But who knows what happened to him? I mean, he's a casualty who never even made it to the United States. I mean, and a lot of these people that I write about, they're all in transition. I don't know the end of their stories often. How are we doing for time, Rob? Okay, just real quick, I want to show you the border wall that we actually have. Despite what you might have heard, we have 300 miles of border wall in Arizona. This is in Nogales. This is how big and intimidating they are already. It's hard to see the proportions. That's like, there's a 20-foot cliff and another 20-foot border wall, and that's all the radar stuff and infrared cameras. And of interest, that's a 19th century border marker. That's what the border used to look like in the 19th century, all along, like every 100 miles or something along the border, there's one of those little border markers. And this is Arizona. We have a lot of border walls already. So yeah, I'll close there. I have lots more to show you, but I know we're running out of time, so.
I have a question about the Marialistas. So they were coming from Cuba, right?
Yep.
So isn't the rule that if you make it to U.S. soil, if you're Cuban, then you get to stay, right?
Yeah, they did stay, but we didn't like them because we thought they were bad guys, Yeah, right. There's that wet foot, dry foot. If they catch you in the water, is that what it is? You can't get in, right? But if you make it to the beaches, yeah.
And that's because we hate Cuba.
Yeah.
Because it's a communist country.
Yeah, because usually we like refugees from Cuba. We like people fleeing from Cuba because they're communists. But in this case, we didn't like them because we thought that Castro was playing a trick on us. That he deliberately released very bad people.
I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you see as short-term and long-term policy solutions.
Oh, God. All this time I've been doing all this work, hoping that, it would make a difference. And now, we have gone so far backwards. Remember the Obama plan that would have allowed the parents, it was called DAPA, the parents of U.S. citizen children who had never committed a crime and whatever. That would have helped a lot of the people that I have written about in my books. But of course, that was shot down in the courts. So I don't know what will happen. Years ago, during SB 1070 in Arizona, that's that very harsh immigration law that we passed in the year 2010, the mayor of Phoenix, who was a Democrat, wrote an op-ed about it. He said, well, why don't we just face reality? We have all these workers here that we need. Why don't we just issue more visas to come here and to begin the path to citizenship? Because it's a very arbitrary thing, how many people are allowed to come every year, right? If you're some very poor person in Mexico, you know, you have to travel to some official office and apply to get to the United States. And the waiting list from people trying to immigrate legally from Mexico is something like 18 years. That's before they even look at your application, you know, for citizenship. So people always say, well, you know, I'm all in favor of legal immigration. Why don't they just come here, get in line? But, you know, we're the ones that make these decisions. And already, you know, we're hearing problems in the farms in California and in Arizona. Those are really hard jobs, you know. And we do have some temporary worker visas that are used for that, but you're starting to see stories about, so why not? You know, why not let people come? I don't really understand why not. I would think that would be it would appeal to people economically, but the guest worker programs can be problematic because if people are really, like there's this big case in Florida where these people were picking tomatoes in Florida and had been enslaved. You know, it was really a horrible situation. And some of these temporary visas are allied with a particular employer. It's not like if this guy's a jerk and decides to enslave you and take all your papers and everything, you can't really like go to the farm across the street because it's only valid, you know, the farmer has to make the request for these workers to come in. So I don't know, I don't really have a solution right now. I do feel that it's a very discouraging time, and we were talking in Professor Kirk's class today about the history of hatred in immigration, and it goes back to the very founding of the Republic. You know, I'm from Philadelphia originally, and there's this great quote from Benjamin Franklin. He's dissing the Germans, all these Germans living in Philadelphia, and they weren't getting with the program, they weren't speaking English, they were clannish, you know, he thought they should really step up. So that's like, you know, 1776, you know, because they were different, you know, so it's kind of embedded in who we are. And then I often think 100 years from now, people will be boasting, oh, my great-grandmother crossed the desert in Arizona because she wanted to be an American, and everybody will say, yay, just like the Europeans coming on the boats and how much they suffered. But while it's happening, we always hate the newest people. I don't understand it. I guess I really don't have solutions. Does anybody have a plan?
Well, we could start by passing the DACA legislation and letting those people stay.
Yeah.
I mean, they're totally blameless, you know, all those kids that were brought over, and they view themselves totally as U.S. citizens.
I know. But, you know, it seemed like it was an easy thing. Well, Senator Flake from Arizona said he was going to start introducing a temporary bill again just to get past this, like a 3-year bill with includes $7 billion for border security, and then look at it again in 3 years. You know, at least so they won't all start getting kicked out next week? March 5th, pretty soon coming up. But I mean, I didn't understand Trump's objection to the bipartisan bill. It wasn't that different from his, you know? It was the same thing, path to citizenship, a lot of money for border security, changing the family unification, right? You guys know that's one of the things we've always had migrants who, you know, say, migrants might have children who are U.S. citizens. In the past, when they reached adulthood, they could apply for their parents and get them green cards. Or they could apply to have their parents migrate to the United States. And we call that family unification. And it always seemed like a nice thing. You get these big family groups, and that's the way immigration has worked for centuries, really, in the United States. And suddenly, it's become this bad thing, and they changed the name of it to chain migration, and how it's really, really bad for the United States. There's all this rhetoric about it, and I don't even know where that came from, because not too long ago, all the Republicans and everybody would say, well, I'm in favor of legal immigration, you know, I'm not a racist, you know. But now all of a sudden, we're attacking these means for legal immigrants to come, you know.
Have you ever had an opportunity to talk to Border Patrol agents or DHS agents and understand what is their background, What is their motivation and why are they doing it?
Yeah, if you're riding at one of those vehicles with one of those guys for 10 hours, then they start, really telling you more. And I remember one day I'd spent a whole day with this guy, and he had a Hispanic name. He was from Texas. And he finally started talking about it. He said, my mother's so mad at me that I joined the Border Patrol because, she's a Mexican person, Mexican-American in Texas, and everybody hates the Border Patrol. And then he says, well, I'm just doing my job. And another thing that they like to say is, I'm doing a really good job, I'm protecting my country. After 9/11, immigration was redefined as terrorism to a large extent. And we were talking about that in class today, that every immigrant was redefined as a potential terrorist. And that's the whole rap of the Border Patrol along the border, that's why we're doing it. The ICE guys, they're very hard to get through. I've never had those long-time experiences with them. And the ICE PR machine is really very rigid. I did a story last summer about the really poor food in detention center, and I collected all this evidence and testimony about worms in the food and everything. So then I had to call the ICE PR person for a response, and that's the only person you can get to. And she writes back, with this canned statement, we provide high nutrition and we've won prizes and we conform to all standards. So I've never had an intimate conversation with an ICE guy and how he or she might feel about barging into people's homes and dragging the data away. But it is good. I've noticed kind of on television stuff, you see it online, has been getting some attention. Pictures of the weeping family at the airport and the father has to get on the plane. So we're hearing a little more about it.
So I've read some reports about dangerous conditions of deportation and sort of stories of people arriving in the middle of the night or being targeted by gangs and criminal activity once they arrive because they know that there's no family network really, or they don't know the area. But it seems that there's not a whole lot of information available about what happens once people do arrive on the other side of the border. So I'm wondering if you could speak some to if you've seen any sort of high risk factors once people are deported, what goes on the other side of the border.
I have in my book a young girl, a teenager from Tucson, get tossed over the border in the night, and she was terrified. There were these men that were trying to, persuade her to be in their brothel and so forth, and she became so scared that she raced through the Border Patrol, the border crossing things so that she would get arrested. And then, once you get arrested like that, you're in big trouble. One of the things that happens is, yes, they're very vulnerable, and that's one of the things the nuns talk to them about in that dining hall. And they have to be very careful because these coyotes hang out around the comedor because they know that they're there. They do things like steal their phone numbers. There's some trick about if they see somebody, I guess, using a payphone, or I don't know how they do it. They grab the phone number, they see the person calling. Do you know about it? How it's done? Yeah, but then they call the families and say, send us $1,000, just like what happened to Joseline's mother. So that's another thing. But everybody on the border, everybody crossing the border has to pay what they call the mafia. I mean, you're paying your own coyote, but now this thing, they all call it the mafia, as the drug cartels control whole swaths of the border, and everybody has to pay a fee to them, in addition to paying your coyote. So, yeah, but there are a lot of stories, people get to a safe house in Phoenix on the north side of the border, and then they're held prisoner there until the families release more money. But it seems like Nogales is not as dangerous as it once was. One thing is that there used to be a war going on between two cartels. My husband and I were driving around there foolishly in rural Mexico one time. We had been on a little expedition to see Altar, which is the city about 60 miles in, where the immigrants can connect with coyotes. And we drove through this one little town, and we both had this sensation we better get out of here. We were taking a back way, a shortcut through this little village, and we just said, okay, forget that, because we both had that same vibe, and we left. And not long after, there was a massacre on that road because there were these fighting cartels, and something like 20 people were shot to death. So, but right now it's peaceful because one cartel won, so they're in charge and everybody just has to pay them. But I don't know other things like about, women getting raped and all. Is that what you're thinking about? And yeah, I mean, they certainly get raped in the desert. That's very common. I met a priest at a shelter in Altar who said that he tells the women, he gives them a blessing and says, you can go get birth control pills, because so many women get raped on the, they're there in the wilderness. These are criminal people, mostly those coyotes, and so some women will do that, get pills so they won't get pregnant on the way.
You talked about the cyclical, these sort of how it's embedded in being U.S. American, right? And I wonder if, and this is a question I ask myself too, looking at these processes, if there's signs, in all this work and reporting you've done, that maybe this isn't just cyclical. I think that's hopeful, hopefully, in 100 years, but that this is actually something even deeper around race. It's very different if, European immigrants that were coded and eventually assimilated into whiteness versus what we're living and seeing now, and the level of human how systematized the human rights violations are in these sort of CCA and others. Like, if there's any sort of lights going off that, wait a second, this might be different or not for you. And
so you mean like worse permanently?
Yeah, or coming, maybe is this, are these two Americas sort of coming to a head? Is this, are we not just going to pass through Japanese internment and then read about it in history? Is this really, there's something bigger and more concerning happening,
Yeah, it feels that way right now for sure. Students say, well, what are you hoping to accomplish? And I said, well, I had really hoped to change things, and I feel like I have failed. And then he came up to me afterwards, he was very sweet, and he said, you know what, it's really important, this is in the record, and I know that things will change. So I thought that was nice. He was from an immigrant family, but yeah, but you're right. Did you ever read the book, How the Irish Became White? Really interesting, right? Because people thought they were a different race, and they hated them, and they drew them in cartoons like monkeys and all. But then gradually they become white people, and nobody would ever think an Irish person now was not white. But yeah, we obviously have more problems with race than we do with nationality because, if you're white, nobody's bothering you. They have deported a few Irish people lately. I think they're doing that on purpose to just say we're not racist, but in Boston there's this whole community of people, and there have been some widely publicized deportations of Irish people, but I hope you're wrong. I hope that this is just a bad phase in U.S. history, but I don't know. Do you think really, this is the beginning of?
Well, I think also if you look at U.S. history from the perspective of African American experience as hegemonic, as sort of the reality, then this isn't such an anomaly. But it's also concerning that we're talking about major industries, the military industry investment in this, the private security industry investment in this, in the, not just the border wall, but all of the whole system. Yeah. I think there should be a lot of warning. And then the way it's coupled with a lot of attacks on things that we hold sacred as U.S. citizens, like check of powers, the relationship between Congress, executive branch, and Supreme Court. I think that I would be very, very concerned that this is part of a norm, but it's a norm that's becoming, part of the way the government is functioning in ways that maybe, at least not in my lifetime, we haven't sort of been as aware of or seen. I think that is also the next question, not to stay there, if that is the case.
Yeah. Well, as a journalist, I guess I feel that I should keep writing even if I'm discouraged. Again, we talked about that today in class. It's like I've spent my whole career, I do a lot of statistics in my books along with those human stories, and I really research this stuff to find out the reality. And then this guy comes along and he stands up, he says, well, you know, Mexicans are rapists and murderers, as Professor Kirk reminded us. I mean, it's like, what? You know, and everybody goes for that then. And that's how I've spent my life, you know, trying to write things accurately and find out what's really happening. So that part of, you know, what's going on is very upsetting to me. But what you guys can do, at least you can vote, you know. The young people, somebody was saying that about those kids in Florida, those kids in the high school that got shot up, and how they're just, this is the first time we've really seen a real political response, I think, haven't we, to one of these shootings? And Eileen was saying, my sister was saying, well, they're all turning 18 pretty soon, you know, so, but I don't know. I mean, there must be a lot of conservative youths also. But yeah, I hope we're not turning into an authoritarian country as opposed to a democracy. That sounds like maybe we are, and I don't know.